the only way that Russia is getting people, it's used up all its prisoners. I mean, the jails are pretty empty because they've all gone to the front line. It's enticed people by paying them a king's ransom, if you like, in Russian terms. It's bought soldiers off North Korea. I mean, this is desperation. So, I think one has to assume that Russia is running out of people who want to go and fight for it.
Hey, Mr. Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, we'll start off with the fact that today, Friday, August 1st, it's a big day when it comes to these ongoing threats from Donald Trump. But this particular threat, Donald Trump gave India till August 1st to broker a new trade deal. He doesn't think that the trade agreement that the two countries have is fair on the United States. So as of today, and we haven't heard from Donald Trump because, of course, the US is just waking up, but he threatened a 25% tariff on imported goods and an undisclosed penalty to India for buying a vast majority of their military equipment from Russia and Russia's largest buyer of energy, along with China, at a time when everyone wants Russia to stop killing in Ukraine. So, Hamish, if this kicks off today and Trump actually follows through with his threat, what impact would that have on Russia?
Well, hopefully it'll have a really significant impact. We know that the Russian war machine is ostensibly being fueled by the hard foreign currency that Putin is getting from his oil. Before the general world oil price was down, Putin was selling cheap oil ostensibly to the Chinese and the Indians and selling a lot of it and getting a hell of a lot of money out of it. But if India and China, if India in particular, stop buying Russian oil, then that would have a huge impact because not even Putin can make bombs and bullets without hard currency. So I think it's a very important step when it comes to the Indians buying Russian military equipment. Well, that has sort of always happened, and India itself tries to make a lot of its own stuff at the moment. Quite a lot of it copied from the Russians and also from the West to a certain degree. But India is a huge player here. I mean, I think they are now the most populous country on the planet. They have a rather ambiguous sort of relationship with the West and the East, if you like. But I think if President Trump can persuade the Indian Prime Minister Modi to stop buying Russian oil and to stop buying Russian equipment, and there are some hints that maybe India is helping Russia in other ways. But if Modi can be persuaded not to, I think that will be a really big step, because I think quite a lot of things are happening at the moment, putting pressure on Russia, and the more pressure that can be put on Russia, quite frankly, the better.
And one of the arguments, I think Reuters reported this last week, that a take that Donald Trump could go down a road he could go down would be to directly speak to Narendra Modi and say, hey, look, can you stop buying crude oil from Russia, which I think is 1/3 of their crude oil comes from Russia, and then go directly to Saudi Arabia or one of the other Gulf states and say, do you mind pumping more oil for India so that there's no gap in the market, there's no price hike, which we saw, of course, at the start of the war, which is a pretty understandable concern from Donald Trump's part, in order for Americans to avoid having to pay more for oil. But in terms of weaponry, Hamish, what are the kind of weapons that India is purchasing from Russia? Are they up to scratch?
Well, on your first point, I would hope that Trump is speaking directly to the Indian government and Narendra Modi. They seem to be fairly similar characters, and they have fairly similar sort of ideas. So I hope they're speaking direct. We know that the Saudis are looking to reduce the price of oil to affect the Russians. So it's something that can happen relatively straightforwardly. So that should be going on. When it comes to equipment, the Indians have bought, their tanks are pretty much Russian tanks. We know that they bought quite a lot of Russian air defense assets. And other bits of kit, but they've also purchased Western equipment. I think the attraction of Russian kit tends to be a lot cheaper than Western kit. And one of the reasons it's a lot cheaper is it's not as sophisticated. It's sort of last generation, whereas American and Western equipment, we describe it as fourth generation. What we're saying is it's much more advanced. So that's what the Indians are doing. And when you've got an army over 1 million people, the Indians probably feel they can't afford to buy expensive or more expensive Western kit, even if it's a lot better. But I think people are now beginning to realise that actually it's quality of equipment as much as quantity that is really, really important. And I'm sure that that President Trump would look at favourable terms with India if India were to switch more to American equipment than it is at the moment. And actually, we know that the Russians are desperately in need of their own equipment. They're not actually selling an awful lot of military equipment abroad at the moment because they need it themselves. I mean, only a piece I wrote yesterday trying to equate how many tanks the Russians have lost. If you believe the Ukrainians, it's 10,000 tanks. Most other sort of independent, in inverted commas, advisors are sort of saying it's 5,000. So, I don't think the Russians have a lot to sell at the moment, but psychologically, it would be a really positive move if the Indians turned away from Russian kit and looked elsewhere in future.
But would the only way you see that happening, Hamish, is if Donald Trump offers a discount to India?
Well, certainly favourable conditions, or whatever the correct term is, would make a lot of sense because, I mean, we just know with the UK buying F-35As, the fourth generation stealth bombers for the new British tactical nuclear capability, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, when you look at other pieces of equipment like I suppose tanks or even a basic rifle, if you're buying Western, you're paying an awful lot more because that's with the quality. So in order, I expect for the Indians to be persuaded to buy Western and particularly American kit, I'm sure they would need to be incentivized. But that seems to be the way that President Trump does business. So it's not beyond possibility, I wouldn't expect.
Let's get into kind of what's happening on the ground between Russia and Ukraine. What do you, from your intel with the military, how do you think Russia is going in terms of the strength and capability of their own military stockpile? Do they have enough? Are they losing a lot? You mentioned the amount of tanks. We're never going to know the proper amount as propaganda seeps from the Kremlin constantly, Hamish. But how is their weaponry going? How are their missiles going? Are they struggling for stockpile?
Well, I think there's several things to look at this. When we look at the tactical battle in Ukraine and what we're talking about here, on the demarcation, on the front line, as it were, the contact line, as it's called, virtually nothing has happened. No big movements have happened in the last 12 months. I mean, there have been a few. I mean, the Russians talked about a big offensive they had a few weeks ago with a number of tanks and armoured vehicles. But actually, they were all pretty much destroyed. We've discussed before, the Russians are still using industrial amounts of chemical weapons on the front line. They've still using chloropicrin. They're making small advances. But actually, the British government have sent tens of thousands of gas mask respirators, which are now arriving at the front line, which is negating that advantage that the Russians have. We know they've tried to encircle Sumy, a big town in the sort of northeast, because that would allow the Russians to attack into Kharkiv, which is the sort of third city. But at the ground level, they're making little progress. We know that at what we call the deep battle, in other words, deep into Ukraine, the Russians have really unleashed an unbelievable wave of drones and missiles, particularly at civilian targets in Kyiv and elsewhere. Over 500 missiles and drones a night are being fired. And this week alone, a number of Ukrainian civilians have been killed. So that seems to be what Russia is focusing at the moment. However, you look at the deep battle that Ukraine's taking part in. We've discussed before Operation Spider's Web, which destroyed, a third of Russia's nuclear aircraft bomber fleet. But we also know that Ukrainian cyber attacks They brought down the Airflot, the Russian airline. Russian people who can't go to the Mediterranean for holidays, relying on going to places like Sochi, they're getting increasingly frustrated that Ukrainian drones are preventing them getting on aircraft, and now cyber attacks have done that. So Russians in Moscow and St Petersburg are really hacked off. And also we know that Ukrainian cyber attacks on pharmacies, particularly in Moscow and St Petersburg, have shut them for days and days. So there's a lot happening in what we call the deep battle. But on the front line, it's all pretty static. And very long-winded answer to your question, are the Russians running out of kit? Well, they're running out of manpower because they've just bought 30,000 souls, for want of a better word, off North Korea. They're desperately trying to get more missiles and ammunition from Iran, but Iran's sort of pretty much run out. And at the moment, it seems they're, again, relying on North Korea for ammunition. The final bit to this, Russia trumpeted that they were making 200 Shahed drones, these Iranian drones, at a factory deep in Russia. And then pretty soon after that's attacked by drones. So, yeah, the Russians must be struggling because, everything's gone a bit static. They've lost 1 million casualties. And as we all discuss, their nuclear deterrence is potentially under threat as well.
Well, we'll get into that in a little bit, but I want to talk about your colleague, your Telegraph colleague, Kong Kongdon. He said that Putin's summer offensive so far has failed miserably. Now, if anyone is wondering what this is, the Kremlin, the Russian army, they've all obviously come out and said that for the summer period, Russia is going to hit Ukraine harder than they ever have. Now, he says that failed miserably, as certain regions that Ukraine wanted to start occupying are still very much in Ukraine. Sorry, that Russia wanted to occupy are still very much in Ukraine's hands. And as you mentioned, Hamish, Russia's casualties have hit over the 1 million mark. So do you agree with this statement that Russia's summer offensiveness has failed miserably?
Well, all the evidence would suggest that. And the fact that the Russians trumpeted this so much, in the spring and early summer that they were going to do it, and actually they've achieved very little. I mentioned they've tried to surround Sumy to attack Kharkiv. They've been trying to take Petrovsk down in the sort of southeast, for the last 18 months. And this is where they've used a heck of a lot of chemical weapons, but they've got nowhere. They've tried to take Chesimar again, which they claim to have taken, but actually haven't. The challenge they've got is that their professional army was pretty much wiped out in the first year of this war, and they're relying on conscripts who they just don't train. And you need to be a trained soldier to be able to operate some of these complex moves, which they just can't do. And I think from Ukraine, Ukraine has really mastered the drone warfare piece. And although the Russians use drones as well, but Ukraine seems to have mastered it. And each time Russia tries to make some attack, and they're fairly small, half a dozen tanks, a few armoured vehicles, and a couple of hundred soldiers, they're very easily picked off by the Ukrainian defenders. So yeah, I think at the tactical level, Russia has completely failed. What we're seeing now is them trying to just bomb Ukraine, bomb Kyiv and other cities into submission, and they are killing a lot of civilians, and it's pretty horrific. And I think the Ukrainians are getting desperate. But again, I expect President Trump really holds the key with what he's threatened to do and what he does next.
Well, one of the things that Donald Trump has done is, of course, approved these Patriot air defence systems paid for by NATO, but provided by the United States. Some of them have already arrived in Ukraine. Others will seep over the new year. But then the other thing is, Hamish, that Trump cleared the sale of Hawk missiles and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. So more stuff to be sent to Ukraine. So how do you think this weaponry will change the game for the Ukrainian army?
Well, I expect the most important issue will be psychological. In warfare, psychology is 10-1 the physical, and that by withholding weapons, that really affected the morale of the Ukrainians. Now that that's been turned on, it no doubt will be affecting the morale of the Russians, knowing that that they can. It is likely that the attacks on civilian targets will be less effective because of these Patriot missiles. Conversely, of course, US has turned on the taps on some of these more sophisticated precision-guided missiles, and the very famous report a couple of weeks ago, Trump suggesting that Zelensky might want to fire a missile into the Kremlin, and actually that to me was quite a clever move, because the Russians now know that their air defense is not very effective against American missiles, and that was demonstrated in the attack on the Iranian nuclear power plants last month. So the psychological impact on Moscow of knowing that if President Trump gave the go-ahead that Zelensky could start putting cruise missiles into the Kremlin, that would be a real game changer, I think. But also the fact that Ukraine can now attack places like that drone factory that we were talking about earlier, and other strategic air bases to really denude the sort of logistic support to Russia. And the other thing that this does, this is putting the war into the very front rooms of the Russians in Moscow and St Petersburg, who have been completely immune to it really for the last 3.5 years. But now it's coming home to them. And these influencers are the ones who might be the ones to change Putin's mind. So, yeah, I think, there is a lot of positivity, a lot of psychological and morale building that is happening at the moment. And if Trump carries through with his threats on sanctions and tariffs, and that he's threatening, along with the Indian piece we've discussed, and with the 10 days rapidly running out. I mean, it's difficult to know sometimes what timeline Putin is on, that Trump is on, but in theory, his 10 days he gave Putin last weekend is about to run out.
It's the 5th or the 7th of August, Hamish, so we're not far off if that does follow through. Now, we've spoken about what's happening on the ground and in the air when it comes to this war, but Russia's Navy has also suffered a lot as Ukraine has taken out about 1/3 of their Black Sea fleet. But Mother Nature also might come into play here, Hamish, or may have. We just don't know when it comes to, of course, propaganda. But Putin's nuclear submarine was sitting dangerously close to the epicenter of an 8.8 megaquake. So is there any word on if this was destroyed?
Well, we don't know yet. There's been some satellite imagery published in the last 24 hours showing that there is damage to that strategic nuclear port on Russia's eastern seaboard with the Pacific. The deafening silence coming out of the Kremlin about this, does lead one to suggest that maybe there is something to the rumours. But I think if we, look at the facts as we know them at the moment, this submarine base, 75 miles away from the second largest earthquake ever recorded on the planet, you would expect some damage. I mean, we just have to look back to the Fukushima disaster in Japan, a little bit to the south of this, a much smaller earthquake creating the tsunami, which created devastation in Japan. So I think it's not unreasonable to assume that there may be some damage. This is the base for the majority, we understand, of Russia's strategic or ballistic nuclear submarine fleet that has its ballistic nuclear missiles. And when you put that together with the Operation Spider's Web, which destroyed 1/3 of their tactical aircraft that would deliver nuclear weapons, there is a problem for Russia with its the whole issue, the whole thing about the nuclear deterrent is balance and equilibrium. And one would suggest at the moment that balance is not in Russia's favour. And, only this week, Trump has again admonished or has taken to task Medvedev, who used to be the Prime Minister of Russia, for threatening nuclear attack on Europe and the States. And but now, that is falling on very, very sort of thin ice, because it could well be that there is a balance very much in favour of the West now. Now, whether the West decides to exploit it or not, I think we're all very, very careful when it comes to these type of issues. But yeah, I think Russia's nuclear deterrent has really come under extreme pressure in the last few months, and most particularly this week.
Well, Putin's naval parade was meant to take place last Sunday, Hamish. They cancelled it, the Kremlin cancelled it over security concerns after Ukraine had successfully been striking St Petersburg. So does that indicate to you that he was worried he might be targeted?
Well, that again is another really significant issue. I mean, we know how much the Russians love their parades. The sort of victory parade on the 9th of May that we reported on, is the biggest day in the Russian calendar. Putin happened to threaten, hell and earth and damnation to make sure that the Ukrainians didn't attack that. The fact that he can't even conduct his naval parade. I mean, we know the Russian Navy is in a pretty shocking state. They've had to retire their only aircraft carrier they've ever had because it was, basically didn't work. We know a lot of their ships are in a pretty poor state. And of course, we talked about the issue with the submarines. So I think psychologically, that's a massive blow. There's no way they can hide that fact from, the good folk of St Petersburg, no doubt, love the day when they go out and look at their Navy ships steaming up and down outside the port. But if they're not there, that really sends a message that, the great President Putin cannot even organise a naval parade because of the potential danger of a few little Ukrainian drones upsetting him. So, yeah, I think psychologically, a massive impact. And let's hope people in St. Petersburg and Moscow are really absorbing that fact.
Well, let's get into the Kremlin's response to these sanctions, Hamish. They've really changed their tune in the fact that they're coming out and basically saying, these don't affect us, blah, blah, blah. They're really scoffing at Donald Trump as he changes back onto the side of Ukraine. Now, of course, as you mentioned, Donald Trump, he slashed his 50-day deadline last week to 10 to 12 days. That takes us to the 5th or the 7th of August. The Kremlin released a spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov. He released a statement saying, we have been living under a huge number of sanctions for quite a long time. Our economy operates under a huge number of restrictions. Therefore, of course, we have already developed a certain immunity in this regard, and we continue to note all statements to come from President Trump, from our other international representatives on this matter. So if that's the case, Hamish, and they're already immune to sanctions, should Trump be testing this theory right now?
Yeah, absolutely. What the Russians are forgetting, or what the Russians are not saying, it might not, more sanctions against Russia might not have a lot of impact because, let's face it, they haven't been able to buy much. Their people have got used to it. It's not the sanctions against Russia that will make the difference. It's the secondary sanctions. It's the sanctions against India. It's the sanctions against China. It's the sanctions against anybody else who does business with Russia. That is what will make the difference. That is what Peskov and Medvedev and all the others are missing. What we're talking about here is the billions and billions of dollars that Russia is getting from outside. It's cutting that off that will make a difference. Absolutely. Maybe the Russians won't feel it directly, or not soon. But, the fact that even potatoes are now 3 times the price they were last year, that is having a huge impact on people. So, I think Russia's trying to put a brave face on it, but actually they know that if the Chinese and the Indians and others can be persuaded to step away from Russia, then Putin is in a very tight position. And of course, actually Putin and Medvedev and Peskov don't really care, but the people, the rank and file who are really suffering at the moment, hopefully this might be the final nail in the coffin, which will actually encourage them. They've seen that they can't see their naval parade and all the rest of it, might encourage them to suddenly go, this is not good. We need a change here. So, I think the tariffs and sanctions will make a difference, but they're the ones on China and India that will, not the ones on Russia.
Russia's foreign ministry spokesperson, he said that we see that the West simply cannot let go of the issue of sanctions. It seems as if they are constantly stuck in a rut. Apparently they have no other options left. They have been exhausted. Hamish, but if Russia has suffered the 1 million casualties that analysts would say that they have, and the West then cripple Putin's economy through these secondary sanctions and these tariffs, then how will he entice Russians to even fight in his war, considering that that is a massive, that's the reason why a lot of these Russians, besides conscription, fight, because they get paid a bigger wage than they normally would in another job.
Well, I think this is the issue. I mean, I'm staggered that people in Russia are not making more of an issue of the casualties. When you look back to Afghanistan, when 17,000 Russian soldiers were killed, the babushkas, the mothers of Russia, marched on the Kremlin. And the question I keep asking, and a friend of mine who is a real expert in this was telling me exactly as you've alluded to there, the soldiers who go to the front line are on double, triple, the average wage. And most people in Russia think they're just mercenaries. So actually, they sort of, it's good riddance. However, with the shortage of conscripts, even being paid a lot of money, Putin now needs to go to the rich and wealthy in Moscow and St Petersburg. And once their kids start getting conscripted, I think things will change. And of course, if Russia runs out of money, they won't be able to pay these vast salaries that they've been paying. And, the debts, and we know the debts that are built up, the banks in Moscow are now openly saying that they are in freefall. They are in danger of default. And again, although Russia is a autocratic dictatorship run by Putin, it can't run on thin air. And the air is getting thinner as we speak.
Is Russia running out of soldiers in general, do you think, Hamish?
Well, I mean, Russia is still a country of a couple of 100 million. So it should not be. And history tells us that Russia is able to absorb unbelievable amounts of casualties, 26 million in the Second World War. When you think the British people lost 345,000 in the Second World War against the Russians' 26 million, our views of casualties and numbers, it's very difficult for us to understand. So in theory, Russia should not be running out of potential conscripts at the moment. But, the only way that Russia is getting people, it's used up all its prisoners. I mean, the jails are pretty empty because they've all gone to the front line. It's enticed people by paying them a king's ransom, if you like, in Russian terms. It's bought soldiers off North Korea. I mean, this is desperation. So, I think one has to assume that Russia is running out of people who want to go and fight for it. And that's why the West must keep the pressure up. And Trump is the leader of that pressure. And let's hope that he stays firm and doesn't go back to his old ways of changing his mind every 24 hours.
Of unpredictability. Hamish to Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thanks very much for having me.